A medieval household consumed over 2,000 pounds of grain each year and never visited a store. No refrigerators, no supply trucks, no backup plans. How did families survive 12 months on what they grew in just 4? This is the story of planning, patience, and a system we've completely forgotten. Let's go back to when food wasn't convenient. It was survival. Medieval life followed a rhythm most of us can't imagine. For 3, maybe 4 months of the year, late summer into autumn, fields were full. Grain ripened. Vegetables grew. Animals fattened. Households worked frantically to bring it all in, knowing what came next. For the remaining 8 months, nothing grew. Winter stretched long and cold. Spring, the cruelest season, offered little more than mud and waiting. There were no imports from warmer regions, no grocery stores to fill the gaps, no emergency deliveries. Every household lived with the same understanding. What you harvested in autumn had to last until the next autumn. Period. This wasn't a fear that kept people awake at night. It was simply the structure of existence. Everyone knew it. Children grew up watching their parents count sacks of grain, measure portions, and plan meals around a calendar written in seasons, not days. Today, we panic when a store runs out of milk for a day. They plan for months without fresh food. The difference wasn't just technology, it was mindset. And that mindset began with a single shift in thinking. Medieval households didn't think in weeks or even months. They thought in winters. Every decision, how much to eat today, whether to slaughter a pig now or wait, which grains to cook and which to save, was filtered through one question: will this last until spring? This wasn't anxiety, it was clarity. Children learned it by watching their mothers ration flour, their fathers repair storage barrels, their grandparents nod approvingly when food was handled carefully. Planning wasn't a special skill someone taught in a lesson. It was the air they breathed, the rhythm of their year, the culture of survival passed down without words. When you live like this, short-term comfort becomes irrelevant. A feast today meant hunger in February. An extra loaf of bread this week meant less grain for March. The entire household operated as a single organism, moving in sync with the calendar they couldn't control but had learned to predict. We think in meals, what sounds good right now, what's convenient, what we're craving. They thought in seasons, what will keep, what will stretch, what will sustain. It's not that they were smarter or stronger. They simply had no choice but to think long term. And that forced discipline created something unexpected: stability. Because when everyone in a household understands the stakes, survival stops being one person's burden. It becomes shared responsibility. And that's where the real system began. Survival in a medieval household wasn't the job of one person. It was a coordinated effort that required every member to play their part. The system worked because everyone understood their role, and those roles fit together like pieces of a carefully constructed puzzle. Men handled the heaviest physical labor. They worked the fields during planting and harvest, managed the slaughter and butchering of livestock, chopped and stacked firewood for the long winter months, and maintained the structures that kept food safe: barns, storage sheds, root cellars. Their strength was directed toward the foundation of survival. Women managed the transformation of raw harvest into lasting supply. They salted meats, dried herbs, fermented vegetables, rendered fat, made cheese, and baked bread. They decided what to cook each day, how much to use, and what to hold back. Rationing wasn't a mathematical exercise. It was intuition built from years of watching food levels rise and fall with the seasons. Children weren't passive observers. They gathered wild berries, nuts, and herbs. They helped dry fruit in the sun, turned meat in the smokehouse, fetched water, fed animals, and watched younger siblings. Every small task, every pair of hands reduced someone else's burden. The elderly held the most crucial role of all. They were a living memory of the household. They had survived decades of winters. They knew which preservation methods worked, which seasons tended toward scarcity, and how to stretch food when supplies ran low. Their advice wasn't suggestions. It was survival wisdom encoded in experience. Today, one person shops for everyone, then everyone worked to feed everyone. No single individual controlled the entire food system, which meant no single person bore the full weight of failure. The pressure was distributed. The knowledge was shared. And because of that, the system was resilient. This cooperation didn't happen by accident. It relied on something deeper than written instructions. There were no cookbooks in medieval households, no recipe blogs, no YouTube tutorials on how to preserve meat or judge when grain had dried enough for long-term storage. Instead, knowledge moved from generation to generation through watching, doing, and repeating. A child learned to salt fish by standing beside their mother as she worked, observing the amount of salt used, the way it was rubbed into the flesh, how long it sat before being packed into barrels. They learned to judge ripeness, not from a calendar, but from the color of the grain, the weight of the apple, the smell of the cheese. These weren't skills taught in formal lessons. They were rhythms absorbed over years of participation, oral traditions, reinforced what hands-on practice began. Stories carried warnings. The winter, grandfather's family ran out of grain in March because they'd been too generous in January. Proverbs encoded advice. A fat autumn makes a thin spring if you feast too early. Seasonal markers, the migration of birds, the phase of the moon, the first frost, served as living reminders of what needed to be done and when. Mistakes were rare not because people were perfect, but because the systems had been tested and refined across generations. When a method worked for your great-grandmother, your grandmother, and your mother, you trusted it. Innovation was risky. Tradition was safe. And in a world where one bad decision could mean hunger, safety mattered more than novelty. We Google recipes. They inherited systems. Our knowledge is external, searchable, disposable. Theirs was internal, embodied, irreplaceable. When an elder died, they didn't just lose a person. They lost a library of experience that couldn't be reconstructed. But all that inherited knowledge, all that careful coordination, centered around one fundamental skill that made year-long survival possible: preservation. Preservation wasn't something medieval households did occasionally in moments of crises or abundance. It was the baseline of their entire food system, a daily, unremarkable process woven into the fabric of ordinary life. Drying was the simplest and most universal method. Fruits were sliced thin and laid in the sun. Herbs were bundled and hung in dry, airy spaces. Fish were split, salted lightly, and left to desiccate in the wind. The principle was straightforward: remove moisture, and food resist decay. No special equipment required, just sun, air, time, and attention. Salting went deeper. Meat and fish were packed in layers of coarse salt inside wooden barrels, the salt drawing out moisture and creating an environment hostile to rot. It wasn't subtle. Salted meat was hard, intensely flavored, and needed soaking before it could be cooked. But it lasted months, sometimes a full year if done properly. Smoking added another dimension. Meat, fish, and even cheese were hung in smokehouses where slow-burning wood, often hardwoods like oak or hickory, produced thick, cool smoke. The smoke deposited compounds that inhibited bacterial growth while adding deep, complex flavors. Smoking wasn't just preservation, it was transformation. Root cellars provided the final piece dug into the earth. These cool, dark, stable environments kept root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions, beets alive through the winter. The vegetables didn't spoil. They simply waited dormant until they were needed. The cellar's temperature stayed just above freezing, cold enough to slow decay, but not cold enough to freeze and rupture the cells. We refrigerate for days. They preserved 4 months without electricity. What we consider primitive was, in practice, remarkably effective. These methods didn't just work. They worked reliably, year after year, with tools and materials available to anyone. But here's the part we often misunderstand. Preserved food wasn't meant to stay perfect. It was meant to last. Medieval households didn't expect preserved food to remain unchanged. They expected it to evolve, and they were fine with that. Meat darkened as it aged. Its texture hardened. What started as a fresh cut became something denser, chewier, more intensely flavored. This wasn't spoilage. It was transformation. The meat remained safe, nutritious, edible. It simply became a different version of itself, and cooks adapted their methods accordingly. Tougher meat was stewed longer, shredded into porridge, pounded into submission. Cheese followed a similar path. Fresh cheese was mild, soft, perishable. Aged cheese sharpened, hardened, concentrated. Its flavor became more assertive, sometimes overwhelmingly so. But that intensity wasn't a flaw. It meant you could use less to flavor a dish, stretching your supply further. Grain gradually dried out in storage. Fresh threshed grain held moisture. Unsold grain became brittle, its flavors muted. Flour ground from older grain behaved differently, drier, less sticky, requiring adjustments in water and kneading. Experienced bakers knew this. They didn't fight it. They adapted. What medieval households understood, and what we've largely lost, is that food exists on a spectrum, not a binary. It doesn't go from good to bad in a single moment. It changes gradually, and at each stage it remains useful if you know how to work with it. We throw away food past a date. They expected food to transform. Our system treats aging as failure. They treated it as process. The psychological difference is enormous. When change is expected, it doesn't trigger panic. When food is understood as dynamic rather than static, small variations become normal rather than alarming. This acceptance, this fundamental comfort with imperfection, shaped not just how they stored food, but how they ate it. Because eating in a medieval household was never about indulgence. It was about management. Rationing, in the modern sense, feels restrictive. It carries connotations of deprivation, scarcity, sacrifice. But in medieval households, rationing wasn't imposed from outside. It was a natural rhythm built into daily life. Portions were sized not by appetite, but by the calendar. If the household had 6 months' worth of grain stored and 6 months until the next harvest, the math was simple. Divide the supply by the days remaining. Every bowl of porridge, every loaf of bread, represented a known fraction of what was left. This wasn't stressful because it was visible. Storage areas weren't hidden. Everyone could see the grain sacks, count the barrels of salted meat, assess how much remained. That visibility created accountability without guilt. When you can see that the sack of flour is half empty and spring is still 8 weeks away, you don't need someone to tell you to eat carefully. The information speaks for itself. Restraint becomes logical, not emotional. Hunger was normal, not the desperate debilitating hunger of starvation that was rare in well-managed households, but the low-level, consistent hunger of bodies that didn't always get quite enough. People lived with it. They worked through it. It was part of the texture of life, not a crisis requiring immediate solution. And when things got tight, when a hard winter stretched supplies thinner than expected, the community responded. Neighbors shared. Wealthier households distributed to poorer ones, not out of pure altruism, but out of recognition that a starving neighbor was a destabilized community. Mutual aid wasn't charity, it was self-interest properly understood. We diet with guilt. They rationed with clarity. Our restriction is voluntary and therefore feels like punishment. Theirs was necessary and therefore felt like sense. The emotional difference is profound, but rationing alone wasn't enough. What you ate mattered as much as how much you ate, and what you ate shifted with the seasons themselves. Medieval meals weren't static. They moved through the year in a predictable cycle, shaped entirely by what was available and what needed to be used. Autumn was the season of abundance and fresh kills. Livestock was slaughtered, pigs, cattle, sheep, because feeding them through winter consumed resources better saved for humans. Fresh meat appeared on tables briefly, sometimes daily, before preservation began. Vegetables came straight from fields and gardens. Grains were newly threshed. Flour was fresh. For a few weeks, the table resembled something close to plenty. Winter shifted the menu toward preserved and stored foods. Salted meat dominated. Dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils provided protein and bulk. Root vegetables came up from cellars. Porridge thickened with whatever grain was most plentiful. Meals became heavier, denser, designed to sustain bodies working in cold conditions. Flavor became secondary to fuel. Spring was the hardest season. Storage supplies were at their lowest. The previous year's harvest was nearly gone, but the new planting hadn't yet matured. Households stretched what remained. Thin porridge, preserved fish, early greens foraged from fields and forests, wild garlic, nettles, dandelion leaves, anything that grew before the crops came in. It was the leanest, hardest stretch of the year, and everyone knew it. Summer brought relief. Fresh dairy from animals that had begun producing again, foraged greens in abundance. Young animals, chickens, rabbits, that could be eaten without depleting breeding stock. Early vegetables. The table lightened, freshened, diversified. Energy returned. Bodies recovered from the spring gap. We eat strawberries in winter. They ate what the season allowed. Our food system has severed the link between time and table. Theirs was bound to it absolutely. And that binding, that rhythm, created something unexpected. It didn't increase stress, it reduced it. Fear thrives on uncertainty. When you don't know what's coming, anxiety fills the gap. Medieval households lived with scarcity, but they didn't live with uncertainty, and that made all the difference. They knew what to expect. They knew that autumn was the time of plenty and hard work. They knew winter would be cold and the table would rely on preserved food. They knew spring would be lean and uncomfortable. They knew summer would bring relief. This predictability didn't eliminate hardship, but it eliminated surprise, and surprise, sudden disruption, is what breaks people. Routine served as reassurance, the same preservation methods, year after year, the same seasonal markers, the same distribution of roles. When systems are reliable, you stop questioning them. You stop second-guessing. You simply follow the pattern, and the pattern carries you through. Trust built over lifetimes reinforced this stability. If your grandparents survived, your parents survived. and the neighbors survived, you had every reason to believe you would too, assuming you followed the same practices. Tradition wasn't nostalgia. It was evidence. Fear came from disruption, not from scarcity itself. A failed harvest was terrifying. A war that destroyed food stores was catastrophic. A disease that killed livestock could unravel everything. But normal, predictable scarcity, the kind that came every spring, didn't trigger panic. It was woven into the calendar, absorbed into expectations. We fear running out because we never planned to. They planned, so scarcity didn't scare them. Our abundance is fragile, and deep down we sense it. Theirs was limited, but it was also predictable. And in human psychology, predictability often matters more than quantity. Even when shortages hit harder than expected, the response wasn't chaos, because they'd learned over generations how to handle lean times without falling apart. Shortages happened, harvests failed, winters ran long, supplies stretched thinner than anyone wanted. But panic, true, uncontrolled fear, was rare. Why? Because shortages were anticipated, not shocking. Every household knew that some years would be harder than others. Weather was unpredictable. Pests could devastate crops. Illness could kill livestock. These weren't aberrations. They were possibilities folded into the planning. When something is expected, even if undesirable, it doesn't trigger the same psychological collapse as the unexpected. Community mutual aid systems provided a safety net. When one household faced genuine crisis, fire, death, total crop failure, neighbors stepped in, not out of sentimentality, but out of practical recognition that today's crisis could be tomorrow's. And a functioning community required members to support each other through hard times. Sharing wasn't charity, it was insurance. Stretching food happened without drama. Porridge thinned. Bread became smaller. Soups took on more water and fewer solids. Everyone tightened, everyone adjusted, and everyone understood why. There was no pretense, no shame. Lean times were lean. You made it work. Spring was always expected to be the hardest. By the time March arrived, everyone knew supplies were low and the wait until new crops would be long. The entire community existed in a shared understanding of difficulty. That shared experience reduced isolation. No one felt uniquely punished. Everyone was in it together. Resilience came through acceptance, not denial. Medieval households didn't pretend hardship wasn't hard. They didn't sugarcoat hunger or cold. But they also didn't. They understood that difficulty was temporary, that spring would end, that the harvest would come again. Acceptance didn't mean surrender. It meant clear-eyed endurance. We panicked by toilet paper. They calmly shared what little they had. Our abundance has made us fragile. Their scarcity, paradoxically, made them steady. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What does this medieval system reveal about us today? We live in an age of unprecedented food abundance. Grocery stores overflow. Restaurants crowd every street. Delivery apps bring meals to our doors in minutes. Yet food anxiety has never been higher. We worry about shortages despite shelves that rarely empty. We panic when supply chains hiccup, even briefly. We hoard during crises, not because we're facing starvation, but because we've lost all sense of what enough looks like. We've traded scarcity for abundance, but we haven't traded fear for calm. Part of this is structural. Our food system is fragile in ways medieval systems weren't. A medieval household controlled its own production, preservation, and consumption. We control none of it. We depend on trucks, ships, warehouses, supply chains, spanning continents. When any link breaks, whether labor strikes, fuel shortages, the whole system trembles, and we feel it. But part of it is psychological. We've lost the skill of long-term planning. We think in days, maybe weeks. The idea of planning 6 months ahead, of knowing today what we'll eat in February, feels absurd. We've outsourced that thinking to systems we don't understand and can't control. So when those systems wobble, we panic because we have no internal compass, no practiced skill to fall back on. Abundance has also created new fears. We worry about waste, about expiration dates, about whether food is still good. We face choice paralysis in aisles with 50 types of cereal. We obsess over health, over whether we're eating right, over optimizing nutrition in ways that would baffle a medieval household focused simply on having enough. None of this is criticism. These are observations about trade-offs. We've gained convenience, variety, safety from hunger, but we've lost something too. Something psychological, something stabilizing. And maybe, just maybe, there's something we can remember from their approach without trying to recreate their world. Medieval households weren't better than us. They didn't have secret wisdom we've lost. They simply had no choice but to plan. And in that forced discipline, they stumbled into something psychologically valuable. The calm that comes from knowing planning equals control, not absolute control. They couldn't control whether or pests or disease, but control over their response. They knew what they had. They knew what they needed. They knew how to bridge the gap. That knowledge, that clarity, reduced anxiety even in the face of real hardship. Understanding systems builds confidence. When you know how food is grown, preserved, stored, and stretched, you're less vulnerable to fear. You can assess reality instead of imagining catastrophe. You can make decisions instead of freezing. Medieval households understood their system intimately, and that understanding was stabilizing. We're not suggesting anyone live like medievals. We're not romanticizing cold, hunger, or the hard labor of survival. But we can recognize the value of foresight, patience, and routine. The value of thinking beyond the immediate, of planning beyond the next meal, of understanding the systems that feed us. Calm doesn't come from abundance alone. You can have a full fridge and still feel anxious if you do, and understand where that food comes from or what happens if it stops arriving. Calm comes from knowing, from having a plan, even a simple one, even an imperfect one. They didn't survive because they had more. They survived because they planned better. And maybe, in our abundance, there's still something to learn from that, not as a survival manual, but as a psychological tool, a reminder that clarity reduces fear, that planning creates space for calm, and that understanding your systems, whatever they are, makes you less fragile. Planning wasn't about fear. It was about peace. And that lesson, more than any preservation technique or seasonal calendar, is what medieval households have to teach us today. If this perspective helped you see food and life a little differently, consider exploring more forgotten systems that shaped how people lived. More stories coming soon.